Welcome back, everybody, to part 2 of my reboot reaction to the U.S. Civil War, a 2-part series by Oversimplified. I guess you're right, some of you who commented that this is technically not a reaction, as I have already done a reaction, and so therefore I've already seen it. It's really more offering commentary and kind of filling in the gaps a little bit. And a couple of things I want to address from your comments from part 1 of the reboot. Number 1, a lot of you requested that I still make the original available somewhere. And if you didn't see the original, the reason I'm doing this is that it was one of the very first reaction videos I ever did. And it was one of the most viewed reactions. And it was kind of the entryway for a lot of people to this channel. And my style in that one of kind of not pausing but talking over top of the video seemed to be kind of a turnoff to some people, and I didn't want that to be the first impression people had of my channel. So decided to reboot it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I haven't deleted those old videos. I just made them private. So I'm going to put make them unlisted and make them available in the link in the description of this video. So part 2 will be in the link in this one. Part 1 will be in the link in the description of my new part 1. So you'll still be able to see them that way. They won't be available for people to search and find on YouTube. So that therefore it doesn't become the first thing that people see when they first discover my channel. The other thing that I often get comments about has to do with the ads and the monetization. When I do reactions to oversimplified videos, YouTube detects that and automatically monetizes these videos for oversimplified. Number 1, that means I have no control over whether there are ads on this video or how many ads there are. I can't control that at all. All the money also then goes to Oversimplified, so I'm not making any money on this video. So that's why our 150 patrons of this channel, and growing every single day, are so vital and so greatly appreciated because you make this worthwhile for me financially to be able to put in the time to do this. So thank you to all of you. You'll see many of them listed in the description of every video. I update that description about once a week with all the new patrons. Thank you. Let's dive into part 2.
Stick around to learn how you can save money when you shop online. As the Union struggle to take control in the East continued, elsewhere, the war raged on. The Confederates attempted an invasion of Kentucky, hoping the state as a whole would join them, but they were pushed back. The Indian Territory saw Native American tribes ally with one side or the other in the hopes of securing rights after the war. Along the Mississippi, General Ulysses S. Grant remained one of the few Union generals scoring major victories.
So let's talk about Kentucky for a second, because Kentucky, at the beginning of the war, declares itself officially neutral. Kentucky is a border state that's remained in the Union, but does have a strong presence of slavery, especially in the central and western parts of the state, though there is some slavery in the east. In fact, my ancestor, who was a slave, my 4th great-grandmother, was a slave in eastern Kentucky, as were my direct male line ancestors who owned slaves in the eastern part of Kentucky. So it did exist there, just wasn't as prevalent. Kentucky remains neutral, but a Confederate army marches into western Kentucky around Paducah, that area, very early in the war, and Ulysses S. Grant, who's in charge of the Department of around Cairo, Illinois, which is down right in the southern tip of Illinois where the Mississippi River meets the Ohio River. Grant then marches to counter that, and so from that point on, there are Union and Confederate armies operating in Kentucky. Kentucky had an elected Confederate state government, as it did have an elected Union, pro-Union state government. So, you know, a lot of that kind of stuff went on.
With his best pal, General Sherman, by his side, Grant led his armies down the Mississippi to the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg. Both sides knew that if Vicksburg fell, the Confederacy would be split in two, and the Confederates prepared for an intense defense of the city.
And they talked about the best pals, Grant and Sherman. Both guys are from Ohio. Grant's originally from southwestern Ohio, down around Cincinnati. Sherman's from the Columbus area. Sherman was orphaned at an early age and ends up being raised by a prominent family, the Ewings, who he ends up marrying their daughter. But the Ewings, one of the Ewings was a senator. General Sherman's brother, John, ends up a U.S. senator from Ohio. Sherman had strong political connections, comes from that background. They met at West Point, where I think Sherman might have been a year or two older than Grant. And at the beginning of the war, Sherman dealt with some pretty severe mental health issues that almost drove him out of the Army. And he contemplated suicide very heavily. And there's a quote that I often refer to where Sherman said later on, he said, "Grant stuck by me when I was crazy. I stuck by him when he was drunk. And now we stick together always."
But back in the East, Lincoln still wanted somebody to march south and take Richmond. Having given General McClellan the boot, he needed a new man in charge. All right, Mr. President. Option 1 is General Hooker. Bit of a nutcase, but a good general. Option 2, his qualifications are his name is Burnside and he has freaking dope-ass sideburns. Say no more. So General Burnside was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac.
So, first of all, the reason McClellan is fired when he's fired in November of '62, right after the congressional elections, and that's on purpose, because McClellan was a prominent war Democrat. In other words, he was a Democrat, but he was a Democrat that supported the war effort. And Lincoln needed people like that. And so he didn't want to risk the Democrats taking control of Congress. And he didn't want to give them anything to fire up their base. And so he waits until the day after the election, and then he fires McClellan. Burnside wanted no part of being commander of the Army of the Potomac, but understood it was his duty and accepted that. But Burnside knew better than anybody he wasn't qualified to command an army. Now, Burnside wasn't as terrible a commander of the army as people often give him credit for. He was undermined pretty badly by his generals. And in fact, after the Battle of Fredericksburg, some of the generals actually went to Washington on a mission specifically to get him removed as army commander. It was pretty much an all-out mutiny against him.
And sent south, Lincoln hoped he finally had a general who could succeed. Burnside met General Lee at the city of Fredericksburg, where he intended to rapidly cross the river and take the city. But the Union War Department was too slow in delivering the pontoon bridges, and the two sides were forced to camp across from each other, close enough to speak. Hey Yankee, ready to get your butt kicked? Yeah, right, rebel. God is on our side. No way, God's on our side. Oh, you think so? Well, why don't we ask him? Hey God, whose side are you on? Ow. Dude, uncool. With over 100,000 men, the Union Army finally launched their massive attack on the 11th of December. But by now, the Confederates had amassed their forces. During the battle, wave after wave of brave Union men marched headlong into a brutal Confederate onslaught.
So let's talk about this for a second. I want to back up and look at this map, because Burnside's plan was actually a really good plan. It was beset by problems from the get-go. And if you want to understand all the details of the Battle of Fredericksburg, I'll put a link in the description to my visit to Fredericksburg earlier this year. I did, I think, like a 6-part series exploring the battlefield, talking all about it. But the bottom line is he ordered these pontoon boats that were going to give him bridges to get across the river. And they could have gotten across the river into the high ground beyond the river long before Lee got most of his army into position. Lee's army was spread way out over like 20-30 miles. And the pontoon bridges didn't arrive nearly in time. Henry Halleck, who was the commander-in-chief of the army at the time, didn't even put the order in for the pontoon bridges until they were supposed to have already been there. That wasn't Burnside's fault. Once they got across, then the plan was that there was supposed to be this massive attack by like 50,000-60,000 men on the Union left on this area here, while they demonstrated against Marye's Heights. And so they were supposed to attack here just to keep Longstreet's men pinned down, while on the left side they dealt with dealt with Stonewall Jackson. Well, the vast majority of those 55,000-60,000 men never even entered the attack, and yet still General Meade's division broke through the Confederates' line. And if they'd gotten any support at all, they would have routed the Confederate right, and then we wouldn't remember Marye's Heights as this debacle of an attack up that hill. It would have been just the feint that allowed the Union to win the battle.
Were rife with disease. The food was less than appealing. On both sides, men began to leave. Hey, where do you think you're going? I'm deserting. What? Don't you love your country? Yes, I do. And I'm trying to get back to it as quick as I can. Lincoln, ever the kind and caring man he was, spent much of his time pardoning deserters' death sentences. Oh my, here's a 17-year-old boy sentenced to be hanged. Well, I'd better suspend his sentence, or he'll be suspended tomorrow.
Yeah, oh boy. It's true, and you know, desertion was incredibly high on both sides. at least in my personal research into this topic, in the hundreds of military files I've gone through, the vast majority of men who deserted actually came back. Sometimes it was a few months, sometimes it was a better part of a year, and sometimes it was because they issued these amnesty proclamations where you would forfeit pay and have to still make up the time that you missed, but you wouldn't be punished any further than that. But a lot of men did eventually return. Some men deserted because they were bounty jumpers, like they were offering a bounty, like they might give you a $400 cash bonus for enlisting, which was a lot of money, and then they would jump bounty, they would desert and then go enlist again to get another bounty.
What? To try to keep the numbers up, both sides had introduced conscription. There was controversy in the North, however, since rich men could simply pay to have someone else fight on their behalf. Riots broke out in New York City, with enraged mobs furious at the idea of going to fight for slaves, an idea that many of them simply did not support. However, after so much pressure, the Union had finally begun allowing black men to enlist, and these men, knowing what they were fighting for, signed up.
Yep.
By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 troops, 10% of the Union Army, would be black. The valor and bravery they showed throughout, silencing critics.
Yep.
Okay, well that last guy.
And yeah, and Lincoln credited these black men with helping turn the tide of the war. They absolutely had a huge impact. Units like the 54th Massachusetts are remembered the most, but there were a lot of incredible acts of valor among, and blacks could only be enlisted men at the time. They had white officers in command.
Guy was useless. Let's try this Hooker fellow. General Joseph Hooker was put in charge of the Army of the Potomac, and once again Lincoln ordered him to move south and take Richmond. Hooker met Lee at the Battle of Chancellorsville, where Hooker had over twice the men Lee did. Lee was forced to defy all military convention and split his smaller force into two. Lee had absolutely no chance of winning, and Lee won. It was his masterpiece. Lee did suffer one significant loss during the battle, though. As his right-hand man, Stonewall Jackson, was riding back to the Confederate lines at night, the nervous Confederate troops, unable to recognize him, opened fire. And
I'll put a link in the description as well to my visit to Chancellorsville. I retraced the steps of Jackson's famous flank attack, where they marched out and around and hit Hooker's line over on the right flank where Oliver Howard's 11th Corps was. And I also visited the sites associated with Jackson's wounding. So I'll put links in the description to all of those things.
You boys done goofed up. Jackson died 8 days later. As for Lincoln, he couldn't believe it. It was yet another loss, and Northern support continued to waver. While the Union kept on struggling in the East, out west, unconditional surrender Grant was making moves as always. In an attempt to take Vicksburg on the Mississippi, he made a series of risky and bold movements. He sent a cavalry raid and feigned Sherman north to confuse the enemy. Then, aided by a fleet of ironclads on the river, he raced his army south to cross the Mississippi.
This is the campaign you need to study if you are one of the folks who has fallen for the lost cause myth that Grant was not a great general and only won the war because of the sheer brute force of his numbers. And I was one of those people who once believed that. And there were some mistakes, some hiccups along the way early in the Vicksburg campaign, but what he did in the spring of 1863 was absolutely brilliant. And it, to me, is better than anything that Lee did in the entire war. Lee was a better tactician on the battlefield. You know, if you're fighting one battle, give me Lee over Grant. But Grant was actually quite a brilliant strategist. And a lot of that goes back to the fact that during the Mexican-American War, Grant was a quartermaster. So he understood better than most high command the importance of supply and being able to feed and equip your army and making sure logistics were all taken care of. And yeah, I mean, they tried some things, like they actually tried to divert the Mississippi River by building a canal at one point, and all these things that didn't work. But when they actually ran the boats down the river past Vicksburg, got across, and then this Vicksburg campaign where he marches up from the crossing is absolutely brilliant.
Aware that the terrain to the north was restrictive, instead, he strategically moved northeast, hitting Vicksburg's supply line and defending his rear from Confederate armies in Jackson. Once he reached Vicksburg, the Confederate defense became hardened, and Grant was forced to settle in for a month-long siege, during which time he got rather bored. Despite not taking the city, Lincoln loved it and encouraged Grant to hold firm. It would only be a matter of time before the Mississippi was in Union hands. Around this time, the people in the west of Virginia, who had remained loyal to the Union throughout, finally broke away to form their own state. They could have named it anything in the world, but the creative minds at the time came up with the ingenious West Virginia. Back in Washington, Lincoln once again wanted a new general to take command. Oh my goodness, why do all these 19th century generals look so bust? Look, we got Sleepy Eyes Joe here. That's Princess Leia with a mustache. E.T. from
Butler.
the Doctor. Fine, why don't we give Snapping Turtle McGee here a shot? So just
Snapping Turtle McGee. Now, there's actually something behind that name. We'll let the rest of his face come up
General
here.
Snapping Turtle McGee was put in charge of the army of the...
So, George Gordon Meade, who, again, is one of those figures that I don't think gets nearly enough credit. He was a very, very competent commander. What he did at Fredericksburg when everybody else was failing miserably was quite something. But his nickname was a damned old goggle-eyed snapping turtle. And if you look at him, he looked like one. He was born in Cadiz, Spain, I think. I think his father was like in the military and was stationed there or something. But he's a Pennsylvania guy. And was a very good general. One of the best generals in the American Civil War on either side. And people don't realize that about Meade. And Meade did remain in command of the Army of the Potomac for the rest of the war. It's just overshadowed by the fact that Grant, as commander-in-chief, traveled with the Army of the Potomac during the 64 and 65 campaigns.
The Potomac. And it was a crucial time for the Union, because once again, the Confederates decided to go on the attack. So far, they had done exceedingly well militarily. But as the war kept going, the Confederate economy was crumbling. Riots broke out in the streets of Richmond as the price of bread skyrocketed. Supplies were dwindling. Jefferson Davis wanted to send men west to rescue Vicksburg, but General Lee knew the longer the war lasted, the worse their chances got. And he still hoped if he could just threaten D.C., the already demoralized North would surrender. So in June 1863,
and I don't know that surrender's the right word there. Sue for a negotiated peace is more accurate to describe. There was no surrender. It's not like the South was going to conquer the North or defeat it militarily. They just needed to hold on and do well long enough that the North would give up and let the South have their independence.
With the momentum behind him, General Lee once again entered the North, fighting his way through Maryland and into Pennsylvania. General Meade set out to meet him for what would be the most significant battle of the entire war. If the Confederates won, D.C. could fall. If the Union won, it would be a turning point, as the Confederates would run out of steam, and the small town that was to get caught up in the crossfire of the largest battle in American history.
And you've often heard me say, define largest battle in American history, because number one, depending on how you look at how you define battle, some will argue that the Meuse-Argonne offensive in 1918 is the largest battle in American history. You got 1 million American servicemen involved, but that's really a campaign more than a battle. The Battle of the Bulge is certainly much larger than this for the Americans. And even in terms of men on the field, Gettysburg was not the largest battle of the war. Fredericksburg was larger than Gettysburg. I believe Chancellorsville was larger than Gettysburg. And there may have been one or two others. It was the bloodiest battle of the American Civil War with 51,000 casualties, but it was not the largest in terms of the number of the men engaged.
Was Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. On June 1st, units from each army encountered one another and skirmished through the town itself. The townspeople were forced to take refuge, except for one man who reportedly ran outside for a strange reason. "Joseph, what are you doing?" "I'm not gonna let them take my beans." "How many times do I have to tell you they're not here for your beans?" By the second day, over 100,000 men stretched for miles across the battlefield. Lee took the initiative, deciding to hit the enemy's flanks, and he came very close to breaking through the Union's disorganized left.
And another link I'll put into the description below. This entire attack by Longstreet's First Corps on the Confederate right against the Union left, I retraced the steps of that, kind of told as much of the story as I could at the Gettysburg battlefield about 1.5 years ago. It's about a 45-minute video, but I'll put the link in the description for that one as well.
But Union Colonel Joshua Chamberlain ordered a desperate bayonet charge, smashing into the Confederates and forcing them back. The Union forces held across the line. On the final day, Lee believed the Union Army had fortified its flanks, so he decided to finish them off with one massive central assault. And
this is classic Napoleonic tactics that they had learned at West Point. You attack both the flanks, which means they've weakened their rear or their center in order to reinforce where you attacked the previous day. So now you attack the center.
Confederates rushed at the Union lines during General Pickett's charge, and this time it was the Union's turn to unleash hell. Meade had correctly guessed Lee's strategy, and the Confederates were decimated, forced to turn and flee.
And it's really unfortunate that it has gone down in history as Pickett's charge, because there were 3 divisions in this attack, and Pickett only commanded one of the 3. If you go to the battlefield at Gettysburg, most things there refer to it as Longstreet's assault, because Longstreet was the man giving command of it. But he was given divisions from other corps. Only Pickett was actually under his direct command in the 1st Corps.
A devastated General Lee called out to his fleeing and wounded men, telling them it was his fault. And after holding for a counterattack that never came, he ordered a retreat back into Virginia. The North had just managed to score a massive victory, and one they desperately needed. And if that wasn't enough, in the West, after a month-long siege, Vicksburg finally fell.
And there will be people who disagree with me about this, and I guess it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things which one was more important, but honestly, to me, in terms of long-term impact on the war, Vicksburg's more important than Gettysburg. Vicksburg was a big, big, big deal, and it got overshadowed by Gettysburg because Gettysburg was the first real significant defeat that Lee had suffered in the East. There have been some strategic defeats maybe in terms of like throwing him back at Antietam, but that was the first time he was really got his butt kicked on the battlefield. But what Grant did at Vicksburg sealed, I think this is the moment that sealed the fate of the Confederacy.
The North now held the Mississippi, and better yet, it was the 4th of July. With control of the Mississippi, Union forces moved into Arkansas and Tennessee. Tennessee in particular saw heavy fighting, with Union General Rosecrans masterfully pushing Braxton Bragg's Army of the Tennessee out of Tennessee. He suffered a major setback, however, at the bloody Battle of Chickamauga. And
again, there's a lot of these going around right now, but I'll put a link in the description for my visit to the Chickamauga battlefield where I talk a little bit. Didn't have a lot of time, but I did visit the battlefield and talk a little bit about that campaign and that battle itself.
Ended up under a Confederate siege at Chattanooga. At one point during the siege, a temporary truce was declared so that wounded men could be recovered. And often in the Civil War, during these small truces, men from both sides would meet in the middle to trade things like tobacco, coffee, and maybe even honey.
Here comes the ad.
Do you like honey? Me too. Bees are great. And you know what rhymes with honey? Money. Did you know honey can help you save money? Let me explain. Honey is a free browser extension that automatically finds you the best coupon codes when you buy stuff online, for free. For example, here I am purchasing 100 pepperoni pizzas because what the heck, I do what I want. With just a click of a button, I've saved $210. Nice. Honey works with over 30,000 websites, including eBay, Target, and Expedia. And it's already found Oversimplified subscribers over $46,000 in savings. It takes just 2 clicks to install.
And I use it, it's great.
It's absolutely, positively, 100% free. Get Honey now and start saving money by clicking on the link in the description below. Joinhoney.com/oversimplified. That's joinhoney.com/oversimplified. And as always, you'll be supporting my channel. So thank you. Now where was I? Oh yeah, Vicksburg, 4th of July, and the Siege of Chattanooga. Thankfully, General Grant, now in charge of all Western Union armies, showed up and karate-kicked Bragg right back into Georgia. Like this. With Sherman and Hooker, Grant took on Confederate positions.
And it's interesting to see that they show Rosecrans there, because by this point, Rosecrans was actually removed from command of his army. After the debacle at Chickamauga. At the end of the Battle of Chickamauga, Rosecrans and 2 of his corps commanders just fled, just left the battlefield and went back to Chattanooga, which isn't that far away. So George Thomas was actually promoted to command. He was the one corps commander that didn't flee, and he got the nickname the Rock of Chickamauga. He was given command of Rosecrans' army. So yeah, you've got Sherman, Thomas, and Hooker. Yeah, Hooker, who had been fired from command of the Army of the Potomac, actually finds new life in the West.
Positions in the mountains around the city, including the famous battle above the clouds and Mission Ridge. Grant continued to be Lincoln's #1 guy. With these victories, Lincoln hoped the war was finally turning. Back in Gettysburg, the entire town had been turned into a hospital to care for the scores of wounded men. Throughout the war, on both sides, women such as Clara Barton rose to the occasion, doing crucial work on the home front and volunteering as nurses. For those who had given their lives, a new national cemetery was to be established at Gettysburg.
And there was actually a woman, Mary Walker, I think was her name, and I talked about her in my visit to the Medal of Honor Heritage Center in Chattanooga. She is, to this day, the only woman who has received the Medal of Honor, and she was a doctor during the American Civil War. Probably may have been the only female doctor in the Civil War. She initially wasn't allowed to act as a doctor, but served as a nurse, and then eventually was allowed to serve as a doctor. Was given the Medal of Honor, which later on in, I think, the 1890s, they did a review and revoked a bunch of Medals of Honor, including hers. That was when they changed the criteria to make the Medal of Honor something that could only be awarded for battlefield bravery. But I think under President Jimmy Carter in the 1970s, her Medal of Honor was restored to her.
Abraham Lincoln traveled out to attend the opening ceremony. At the event, the main speaker spoke for 2 hours. Then, Abraham Lincoln was called forward to give some brief, appropriate remarks. In just 2 minutes, he masterfully and poignantly iterated America's national purpose and the need to continue the fight. The Gettysburg Address would become one of the most famous speeches in American history. While they were now making progress, the North still couldn't find a decisive victory in the East. And that was bad news for Lincoln, because his presidency was now in its 4th year. In 1864, there was an election coming. The Confederates knew this too, and with little hope left of being able to threaten the North militarily, they believed their last shot at victory may be in the election, since Lincoln, emancipation, and the war itself weren't exactly popular. People in the North were sick of war and wanted to put it behind them. Robert E. Lee hoped that if he could just hold out and continue to inflict more defeats, the people of the North would vote Lincoln out and replace him with a Southern sympathizer who may be willing to negotiate. Lincoln knew now he desperately needed a victory. Now, I know what you're thinking, but oversimplified. If Lincoln loves General Grant so much, then why doesn't he put him in charge of the campaign in the East? Well, guess what, loyal subscriber? You've hit the nail on the head. You're bold, Grant. I'll grant you that.
Oh boy. So yeah, it was after Chattanooga. Lincoln was already thinking about putting Grant in command, but it was after Chattanooga that he really, when Grant came and bailed Chattanooga out and turned the tide there, that he really kind of settled on things. Grant had to be promoted, though, to a rank that didn't exist, because the way the rank system worked, you had, this is kind of confusing, but you have your regular Army rank, and then you have your volunteer Army rank. The same thing was true in World War II, for example. You had 16 million men in the U.S. Army by the end of World War II. Going back down to a peacetime army that was probably 1 million or less, you had a lot fewer positions for generals and officers of all kinds. And so a lot of people who might have been a 3- or 4-star general during the Second World War were going to be reverted to like a lieutenant colonel after the war. And same thing was true in the Civil War. So you had what your regular Army rank was and then your volunteer Army rank. And you could be promoted in both of those. But the earlier the date of the promotion, the higher ranking you were. So Grant couldn't command a guy like Mead, for example, in the field if Mead outranked him in terms of his regular Army Major General promotion. So in that kind of situation, you have to create a new level. So Lieutenant General 3-star was reissued with Grant in mind.
That, I'm promoting you to General-in-Chief, and I ain't taking you for granted. Now I want you to go defeat Lee. Grant me my wish. Please stop. So Grant was put in charge, and he came up with a new plan. He wanted to press the Confederates on all fronts, with General Banks to capture Mobile, Alabama, General Sherman moving south to Atlanta, and Grant joining the Army of the Potomac as they advanced through Virginia. In May 1864, that plan went into action.
And it seems something simple that you'd think would have happened to begin with, but they never really did coordinate everything with a whole country strategy. And so that allowed for things like Chickamauga, which is 2 months after the Battle of Gettysburg. You have Longstreet and most of his entire corps who had fought at Gettysburg come all the way west by rail and fight at Chickamauga. And so they're bouncing troops back and forth to fight against the different armies because they're not being pressed on all sides at the same time.
Sherman steadily advanced on Atlanta, facing off against the smaller Confederate army under General Joseph E. Johnston. In addition, a cruel yet highly skilled cavalry general and winner of the funniest Confederate statue award, Nathan Bedford Forrest, was also nearby, doing his best to threaten Sherman's advance. But in a series of battles, Sherman dominated and pushed Johnston back to the city. But he was held just outside of Atlanta itself and was forced to lay siege. Meanwhile, the main show was happening to the east in Virginia. The Union's top general was finally about to face off against the Confederacies. Lincoln hoped Grant would bring something new to the Eastern Theater, and bring something new he did. As Grant began moving south, Lee still regularly outmaneuvered him and inflicted heavy casualties, hoping to demoralize the North as much as he could. But here's what set Grant apart from others. He knew Lee was running out of men, and that the North by comparison had plenty. Grant would throw his forces at Lee, and even when Lee repelled them, Grant, rather than pulling back, would give the order to keep moving forward and flank Lee, again and again. In under 6 weeks, 80,000 men would be killed, wounded, or missing. In D.C., Grant was criticized for being a butcher. At the Battle of the Wilderness, the Union casualties were so heavy that Grant reportedly began to weep. But still, Grant could replace his losses. Lee couldn't, and he was being pushed all the way back to Richmond. Lee knew once he got there, he'd be under siege. Then, it would only be a matter of time. Close to Richmond, Grant again suffered horrific casualties in a miscalculated assault at Cold Harbor.
And I will say this, from having visited the Cold Harbor battlefield, and I did a video on that one too, and understanding it a little better and doing some study of this, I lay a lot less of the blame on Grant for Cold Harbor than I think a lot of people do. That final assault, that one that everybody remembers from June 3rd that was just a debacle and devastating, was very poorly coordinated and handled by his subordinates. Grant did express regret in his memoirs about having ordered that attack, but that attack could have gone very differently if it had been handled better.
Then, trying to be a trickster, instead of moving on Richmond directly, Grant moved towards Petersburg to flank the Confederate capital and cut its supply line. But, just like Sherman, Grant was halted outside of the city, and he too was forced to settle in for a siege.
And Grant very nearly took Petersburg without firing a shot. It was actually through a mistake on the part of some Confederate soldiers that they ended up being able to hold the city of Petersburg, and there's a whole story behind that, but it could have gone very differently. Grant pretty much caught Lee by surprise with his move on Petersburg.
2 identical sieges would not be good enough for Lincoln's re-election. The people of the North saw the casualties Grant had been taking, and they weren't happy. To make matters worse, Lee had sent Jubal Early north to threaten D.C. with the hope of forcing Grant to withdraw troops from Richmond. Early was repelled on the outskirts of the city, with President Lincoln even attending as an observer, but the North had been given a fright. So with the war currently in a stalemate, who was to be Lincoln's opponent in the critical 1864 election? Who would the Democrats choose? Guess what, baby? I'm back. That's right. General George B. McClellan would run for president against Abraham Lincoln.
Now, if you've ever seen the movie Lincoln, you might remember that one of the most prominent Democrats in that movie speaking out against the 13th Amendment that would abolish slavery was a congressman from Ohio by the name of George Pendleton. George Pendleton is McClellan's running mate for as vice president. He also happens to be the grandson of Nathaniel Pendleton, who was the second to Alexander Hamilton in his fatal duel with Aaron Burr, the second being like your kind of right-hand man. So yeah, kind of a cool story there.
My fellow countrymen, if you elect me, I, the great General George McClellan, will fearlessly and valiantly win the war. Unlike this douchebag, many Democrats, however, including McClellan's running mate, wanted to end the war. So it's possible McClellan may have ended up fearlessly and valiantly making peace with the Confederates, which is exactly what they were hoping for. With the war in a stalemate, and Lincoln still not popular, it looked like McClellan would win, and the Confederacy may have a chance at surviving after all. Lincoln himself said that without some kind of major victory, it seemed exceedingly probable that this administration will not be re-elected.
And to be honest, I think in hindsight we can say that fear was probably overblown, because Lincoln ends up winning a pretty substantial victory. Most of the troops in the field vote for him, but even if Lincoln had lost, you can argue things might have been differently in those months leading up to when McClellan would have taken office in March. By March of 1865, the war was over. I mean, it really was over. It was over, except, the only reason it wasn't already officially over is that they had to wait through the winter to be able to finally push the last attacks in the spring campaign season. But by Christmas of 1864, for all intents and purposes, the war was over. So even if Lincoln had lost, by the time McClellan would have taken office, the North would have won the war, or nearly so. And McClellan, even though his party was opposed to continuing the war, McClellan personally was not.
Well, fret not, Abe, because if it's a major victory you want, it's a major victory you'll get. Atlanta had been under siege by General Sherman for just over a month. After a number of battles around the city, Sherman sent a force south to sever the city's supply line, and Confederate General Hood was forced to abandon it. Atlanta, one of the Confederacy's most important cities, had fallen into Union hands.
Now, important city, yes, but large city, no. In fact, Atlanta, I think, was like the 4th or 5th largest city in Georgia at the time. It was a very small city, but it was important because it was a rail hub and it was a center for supplies and where things come together, which is a lot of what makes cities important at this time, is where transportation comes together.
For many, it was clear that the Confederacy's defeat was now inevitable, and the war would soon be over. When the final results came in, Lincoln had won with an electoral college landslide, with the troops in particular voting overwhelmingly for Lincoln, which must have been touching for their commander-in-chief. Hey man, looks like you lost. No hard feelings? I didn't lose. I merely failed to win. In January, Lincoln involved himself heavily in ensuring the 13th Amendment made it through Congress. In a narrow and historic vote, the amendment passed. Slavery would now be constitutionally banished throughout the nation.
And the movie Lincoln is about that, and I highly recommend it if you haven't watched it already. It will really help with your understanding of the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, why it was needed, and just a little bit more into a glimpse of Lincoln the man.
Black men and women watching the vote from the galleries knew the work had only just begun. A couple months later, at his second inauguration, with victory right around the corner, he didn't celebrate, he didn't gloat.
Now, I don't remember if they actually mentioned this or not, but I'm going to go back and look at it and
knew
pause.
The work had only just begun. A couple months...
Because you'll notice right here is John Wilkes Booth, and Booth was present at Lincoln's second inaugural. If you look at a picture of Lincoln while he's giving his address, he's like up and to the right in the shot, I believe is where he was. But to me, honestly, as much as everybody loves to talk about the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln's second inaugural address to me is the best speech he gave and one of the best speeches in American history. And if you visit the Lincoln Memorial, you walk up to that famous statue of him seated. On one side of the Lincoln Memorial, they have the Gettysburg Address, those words. On the other side, they have the words to his second inaugural. When he said, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right." And he goes on to talk about binding up the nation's wounds and caring for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and for his orphan. Let us do all which may achieve a just and lasting peace with ourselves and among all nations. Just some of the most beautiful stuff he wrote.
Later, at his second inauguration, with victory right around the corner, he didn't celebrate, he didn't gloat. Instead, he emphasized the need for reunification and binding up wounds. To him, Americans, North or South, were to again be compatriots. However, listening to Lincoln speak that day was a man who had no interest in reunification, John Wilkes Booth. An actor living in D.C., was also a deep Southern sympathizer, and as the war turned against the Confederacy, depressed and full of hate, he was already plotting his revenge on the man he held responsible. With further Confederate losses, it was pretty clear at this point who would win. But still, Jefferson Davis showed no sign of giving in. The North were frustrated to see the conflict being dragged out. Why waste more lives? In Atlanta, General Sherman believed he had the key to forcing the Confederacy's hand. He had an unusually modern concept that an army could only survive with the support of the people. Strike at the people, and the army collapses. Sherman decided to do something unprecedented. He would remove his 62,000 men from their supply line and march through the heartland of the Confederacy, where they would live off the land. There, they would wreak havoc. As they marched, they tore up railroads, burned farms, and destroyed communication lines. They also liberated thousands of slaves.
And Lincoln had no idea what was going on. He knew what Sherman's plan was, and I think he said something to the effect like, "I know what hole he crawled into, but I don't know what hole he's going to crawl out of." Like he basically went dark during all this time, and it was only when Sherman arrives in Savannah and connects with the Union Navy that he's able to get a message to Lincoln and let him know what's going on.
The damage done was estimated at $1.4 billion. The tactics were cruel, but to Sherman, it was better than losing yet more men in battle. In December, he reached Savannah, Georgia, but he wasn't done yet. Next, he turned north to inflict his punishment on the first state to secede, South Carolina. As he moved, he came ever closer to General Lee's army, still holding out at Petersburg. The siege of Petersburg had lasted for 292 days. 60,000 of Lee's men had deserted. Numerous Union attempts to break through had failed, but when the breakthrough finally came, it came quick. On April 2nd, a Union assault finally pushed the Confederates from their defenses. Hey man, there's no need to evacuate, right? You'll rescue us like last time, right? Sorry, can't hear you.
Jefferson Davis was actually in church in Richmond when he got a note passed to him that Lee told him, you need to get out of the city. We can't hold any longer. When he knew Petersburg had fallen and Richmond was about to be next.
Lee narrowly escaped the city, hoping he'd be able to meet up with General Johnson and continue the fight. Grant chased him down. Richmond was evacuated, and Jefferson Davis went on the run. As they left, the Confederates set fire to military buildings, but the flames burned out of control, and as the Union troops arrived, they became firefighters. A couple of days later, Abraham Lincoln visited the war-torn city. Grant caught up to Lee at Appomattox Courthouse, where he trapped his forces. It was here, on April 9th, 1865, that Lee saw no point in continuing. Sir? Listen, bub. I drank a bit too much last night, and now I'm hanging like a fruit bat on a hot day.
Not entirely true. Grant was suffering from a debilitating migraine when he got the news that Lee wanted to surrender. Grant got migraines. It didn't happen often, but when he got them bad. Now, you know, you could argue, well, maybe that's just a story to cover up for him having a hangover. But Grant did not get blackout drunk or even drink when things were happening, and there was a lot happening at this time. That campaign, from the time Petersburg fell to when they caught up to him at Appomattox on April 9th, there was a lot going on, and there was constant communication and maneuver. There's no way Grant got drunk. It just does not fit with his MO as far as when he would drink. It was a bad migraine, which he said instantly cleared up when he got the news.
So whatever you have to say, I don't want to hear it. General Lee says he wants to surrender. Hot diggity dog! Grant and Lee met in the home of a nearby farm family, owned by a man who had tried his best to escape the Civil War years earlier, Wilmer McLean. All right, can we all just hurry up and get this over with? Martha, not now! I'm cleaning! Do you want us to get rats? Grant and Lee, after years of war, now spoke respectfully to one another. When Lee left, his face filled with emotion, Grant's men began to cheer, but Grant ordered them to stop.
So a couple of things about this. When Lee told his staff that he was going to go see General Grant, the way he said it was, he said, there's nothing left for me to do now but go and see General Grant. I would rather die 1,000 deaths. When they finally meet at Wilmer McLean's house, Eli Parker, who's on the staff of General Grant, who's a Native American, is there, and Lee made some comment to him about, well, it's nice to see there's at least one real American here. And Parker said, we're all Americans here, sir. It was a nice comeback. General Custer was there. Joshua Chamberlain ends up being tapped to receive the official surrender in terms of the men actually laying down their arms and everything. And men like Custer and others start giving Wilmer McLean money for the furniture. So they start buying the table that the surrender documents were signed on and the furniture that were used in the room. And McLean just made a killing selling all this stuff to these officers.
He knew that now was the time for reconciliation. Just over 2 weeks later, General Johnson would surrender to Sherman, ending the war for 89,000 Confederate soldiers in the largest surrender of the war. Not every Confederate state had surrendered, but the war was as good as over. Across the North, church bells rang out and celebrations. But geez, the man's exhausted.
And he also was pretty certain that he was about to die. He had a lot of premonitions, had a dream about his funeral in the White House that he shared with a lot of people. And he had believed for quite some time that once the war was over, he was over too. And one of the saddest parts about all of this is that Lincoln didn't live for the peace. I think the whole future of our country would have been better, especially for the freed slaves, if Andrew Johnson had never been president.
Cut him some slack. On a carriage ride with Mary, Lincoln clearly was looking forward to being a president in a time of peace. He was apparently very cheerful, surprising his wife, and he told her that between the war and the loss of their son, they'd both been very miserable. Now, it was time to be happy. On the evening of April 14th, Lincoln...
This is very, very cool. I did not catch this before. I don't think I did. You see who's sitting down here? It's General Burnside. And Burnside was down there, I found out, in the last couple of months. He was down below the presidential box, and some people claimed that Lincoln was looking in his direction when he was shot.
Lincoln attended a play with his wife and some friends at Ford's Theater. It was a comedy, and the president appeared to be enjoying it very much. In a nearby bar, John Wilkes Booth swallowed 2 glasses of brandy. He slipped quietly into the president's booth and awaited for the audience's laughter to rise.
Booth, being an actor, who actually, his mailing address was Ford's Theater. That's where he would go to get his mail. He knew the play, Our American Cousin. He knew where the big laugh lines were, and there was this big laugh line that happens on stage where the guy says something like, don't know the manners of good society, eh? Well, I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you sock-dologizing old man-trap. And at that moment, when everybody was laughing, is when Booth pulled the trigger. Now, this was supposed to be a much larger conspiracy. Originally, it was supposed to be General and Mrs. Grant who attended the theater. Mrs. Grant couldn't stand Mrs. Lincoln because Mrs. Lincoln had been horrible to her in the past, had been horrible to other generals' wives like Mrs. Ord. So they decided to go home and see their family. And while they were riding out of the city, Mrs. Grant insists that a man rode up to their carriage, looked inside, and she said it was John Wilkes Booth. They were also supposed to kill Andrew Johnson, which I think probably would have been good if they had, because I think Schuyler Colfax would have been president then. They were supposed to kill William Seward. They actually attacked Seward, but he survived.
The president was shot in the back of the head. Booth fled the city. Soldiers carried Lincoln to a boarding house across the street. There, doctors declared there was nothing they could do. Surrounded by his heartbroken wife, son, and members of cabinet, at 7:22 the next morning, President Lincoln passed away. Never before had a president been murdered. A shocked nation mourned as a 12-day funeral procession carried Lincoln back to his home.
And I know I've mentioned this before, but if you're new to the channel and you haven't heard me talk about this, this is quite an incredible photograph. Because this is in New York City. This is Lincoln's funeral procession, and they actually had funerals in a lot of major cities. The train took like a month to get to Springfield, Illinois, and they would stop in cities along the way and have funeral processions. This one's in New York City, and this building, you see 2 little boys looking out the window. One of those boys is future President Theodore Roosevelt. And the boy with him is his brother, who is the father of future First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. So quite an outstanding, just an incredible photograph of Theodore Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt's father looking down on the funeral of Abraham Lincoln.
In Springfield, Illinois. On April 26th, Union cavalry found John Wilkes Booth in a barn in Virginia, where he was shot. Not long after, Confederate President Jefferson Davis was also tracked down and arrested. Imprisoned for 2 years.
And again, a tie to the future. One of the towns that he rode through on his escape, Jefferson Davis, was in Georgia, and a very young future President Woodrow Wilson, as a child, remembered seeing Jefferson Davis come through town.
He was eventually released. The North didn't want to put him on trial, for fear the jury may rule that Southern secession had in fact been legal. To ensure reconciliation, other Confederate generals and politicians were allowed to re-enter life in the now restored Union. Scattered fighting continued into May, when the last Confederate forces in Texas disintegrated. The southern states came under Northern military occupation to prevent any further rebellion, and a very difficult era of Reconstruction began. Over 3 million Americans had fought, brother against brother. The Civil War remains the bloodiest conflict in U.S. history, but the Union had been preserved. You could say the real winners were those who were to never again be slaves. Further amendments passed by Congress gave black individuals the right to citizenship and to vote.
And it would be so great to be able to say, and they lived happily ever after. But Reconstruction in the post-war South was downright awful for the former slaves, and that's for another discussion. I do want to do some videos on Reconstruction because what the former slaves hoped would happen and what did happen were very, very different things, and it's shameful what those men and women experienced in the post-war South.
Significant progress had been made. However, entering into the 20th century, it was clear the fight for equality would continue. In modern America, the man who fought to preserve the nation and never gave up in the darkest of times stands as a symbol of honesty, empathy, humility, perseverance, and courage. A continuous reminder of what has forged America and what it should ever strive to be.
Okay, so hope you enjoyed that. I'll put those links that I talked about in the description below. Hopefully you'll watch all of those things and check them out. Thank you, as always, for your support, for all of your comments, for your observations, your criticisms, your disagreements, and agreements. It's how we learn. It's how we grow in our understanding of history. So I thank you in advance for all of those things, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.